Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. I would like to talk about corruption tonight, but more specifically, what are we going to do as a country to end this case of corruption, the madness that has destroyed the country? The recent Al Jazeera documentary has made many people sit up and pay attention to the problem of corruption. I think most of them did not appreciate the seriousness of the problem and the extent of it, but now they do. There is no doubt that Zimbabwe is being led by dunderheads. There's no doubt about that. What I would like to uh, underline is that we should not only be looking at Zanu PF being corrupt and incompetent. The opposition too is corrupt and incompetent. Many documentaries have been produced about Zanu PF corruption and mismanagement and tyranny and so forth. But what has not been well articulated is that the opposition itself is equally corrupt and incompetent. Particularly this MDC slash triple C. They have had many golden opportunities to end the Zanu PF misrule, but they failed. In 23 years, they failed to take advantage of it. Listen to this comment by Professor Jonathan Moyo when he was asked about corruption in Zimbabwe.
Are you corrupt? No. In fact, this is laughable. Seriously laughable. First of all, this is an accusation coming from the most corrupt politicians and public officials in the history of our country. They cannot account for the assets that they have. The richest individual in the Republic of Zimbabwe is Emerson Mnangagwa, the one person who was responsible for setting up Zanu PF companies when he was the Secretary for Finance of the ruling party is Emerson Mnangagwa. There is no cent that comes from those companies, including a bank, including investments in the region in countries like Namibia and even South Africa. The person who led the plunder of resources, or even in foreign countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, leading to the United Nations investigating and coming up with a report that is still there, is Emerson Mnangagwa, along with the military cabal of General Chiwenga, SP Moyo, the person who brought the Chinese to plunder Chiazwa Dam resources for Zimbabwe, up to a point where we have, at the very least, over a period from 2007 to 2014, some 12 to 15 billion dollars in diamond revenue that remains unaccounted for, that went into the pockets of individuals. These people have staged a coup, not just to grab power for the sake of grabbing power, but in order to cover up their corruption. That command agriculture was nothing but a looting scheme.
I'm not here to argue about who is more corrupt in Zanu PF. I think history speaks for itself. Professor Jonathan Moyo was in government for all those for donkey years, as well as his other colleagues like Robert Mugabe, and therefore then they failed to address the corruption and mismanagement of the country's resources. And so this is just mudslinging between two equally corrupt and incompetent individuals. But what I wanted to focus on is what he said regarding the looting of diamonds. He said in the period 2007 to 2014, as much as 14 billion US dollars of diamond revenue was not accounted for. And for those who need reminding, that includes the period of 2008 to 2013, which was the GNU. There is no doubt that the MDC, who were in that government of national unity, were aware of the wholesale looting that was taking place in Marange and Chiazo. There is no denying that. The, what matters here is that they did nothing about it. That is what is important. So MDC leaders cannot pretend that they are not corrupt or they were not aware of the level of corruption in Zimbabwe. They were aware of it and they did nothing about it. Worse than that, I think they also benefited from the corruption. One of the primary tasks, in fact, the primary task of the GNU was that to implement the democratic reforms which would have stopped Zanu PF rigging elections. They had 5 years to implement reforms. And yet, in that period, not even one token reform was implemented. Why? Well, the truth of the matter is Zanu PF, Robert Mugabe bribed Morgan Tsvangirai and his friends with the trappings of high office, the ministerial limousines, the very generous salaries and allowances, and for Morgan Tsvangirai, the $4 million mansion in Highlands. And MDC leaders forgot about the reforms completely. They were too comfortable. They didn't want to rock the boat. In fact, at the time, when some of the Zanu PF cronies were asked, why is MDC not implementing the reforms? They even boasted, Mazvane MDC adzidza kuzvianyerere. MDC leaders have learned to enjoy the good life on the gravy train. They are not going to rock the boat. So we cannot deny that MDC leaders are corrupt and incompetent. So the present political system, where is it taking us? We are already in the middle of an election. It's just a matter of weeks before President Mnangagwa dissolves the present parliament and calls for fresh elections. And the date of those elections will be 26th of August at the very latest. These elections are not going to produce any meaningful change at all. At the end of the day, we are either going to have a Zanu PF government, a triple C government, or a combination of the two. The most likely result is, of course, Zanu PF will win its usual two-thirds majority, and the opposition will settle for the one-third. In other words, we'll have the same level of incompetence as we have now, and it's So it's business as usual. We will be stuck with another government of corrupt and incompetent leaders. We will continue to have dunderheads deciding the destiny of this country. Nothing will change. That's the point. We want change, meaningful change. We have got to put an end to this madness of dunderheads deciding the destiny of the country. What can we do now? Well, we cannot stop these elections going ahead. It's too late. We cannot have any meaningful reforms in the next 4 weeks to make sure that the elections are free, fair, and credible. It's too late. We cannot stop Zanu PF going ahead with elections. They are determined to stay in power and they are determined to rig these elections. We cannot stop Nelson Chamisa and company participating in these elections. They are, after all, after the few seats that Zanu PF gives away as bait to entice them to participate. What we can do is highlight the very fact that this electoral process is flawed and illegitimate. Because it is flawed and it is illegitimate. How can you have a meaningful election in which there is no verified voters roll, in which Zanu PF in this case is able to cherry pick the electorate? Zanu PF has denied the 3 million or so Zimbabweans in the diaspora the vote. Purely because the party knows that the majority of those people in the diaspora are either there as political refugees or economic refugees or both. And they blame Zanu PF for their plight. Those people are not likely to vote Zanu PF. Mnangagwa knows that. He had promised in 2018 that the people in the diaspora would be able to vote. But reality has since dawned on him and his fellow Zanu PF cronies that if they still want to hang on to power, they cannot afford the luxury of letting those people in the diaspora vote. Mnangagwa himself, there is an audio of him boasting that they will frog march the rural voters to make sure they vote for Zanu PF. So the process itself is so flawed. How can a process like that, so flawed, be said to have produced a legitimate government? Nonsense. The second part is that the opposition, whose participation Zanu PF is hoping will give the process some modicum of credibility, are participating out of greed. It is the same greed that stopped Morgan Tsvangirai and company implementing even one democratic reform during the 2008 to 2013 GNU. This opposition has lost political credibility. So, a discredited opposition participating in an election, how can it give the winner legitimacy? This whole electoral process must be condemned. And Zanu PF must be denied political legitimacy at the end of the day. That must be our focus. We must not take our eyes off that ball. That is the single most important objective. We must achieve that. Zanu PF must not get political legitimacy out of this flawed process with discredited opposition participating. What would denying Zanu PF political legitimacy achieve, you might ask? Well, it would put us in the same position we were in 2008, when the level of violence that year and the blatant cheating forced SADC and the AU to refuse to endorse Zanu PF as the legitimate winner, and thus forced them to go into the GNU. A new GNU will be different from the 2008 to 2013 GNU in that Zanu PF will not have any leading role, if any at all, in this new one, nor will Triple C. The two parties failed to implement even one token reform in the first GNU. How can we justify appointing them again and expect them to implement reforms? Reforms are the single most important task there, implementing the democratic reforms. So we break this cycle of rigged elections. So we cannot trust them, but we've got enough Zimbabweans out there who can deliver on those reforms. So the reforms can be implemented. The fact that the last GNU failed to implement them does not mean we don't need any reforms. Nor does it mean that those reforms are very difficult to implement. On the contrary, they're easy to implement, just that there was no political will on the part of both Zanu PF and MDC to implement the reforms. What will implementing the reforms do? Implementing the reforms will make sure that from now on our political system allows democracy to thrive. At the present moment, the present political system is so stifling. There is no meaningful debate. There is no meaningful democratic competition for ideas. None. That is what the autocracy that Zanu PF created has done. The kind of leaders that can emerge in both Zanu PF and the opposition are the corrupt, incompetent, and utterly useless dunderheads that we see on the political platform right now. Think of the present system as a sewage pond. The water has been contaminated for all these years. It really cannot sustain fish in it. The only thing you can get there are frogs and maybe catfish. We need to drain this pond so that we can fill it now with clean water. And in it, fish, quality fish, can thrive. Quality leaders can emerge. We are not going to end this madness of gross mismanagement and rampant corruption without ending the system that produces corrupt and incompetent leaders. That is the thrust. That is the focus. We have an opportunity. In fact, it is laughable that We have been led for the last 43 years by dunderheads. What does that say to us as the people? Does it say much? How could you have been led by dunderheads and for 4 decades? Shocking, isn't it? But we can end it now. And I think we need to focus on the task on hand to end the case of rigged elections, which is the root cause why we have corrupt, incompetent dunderheads deciding the destiny of the country. We are not being outwitted by dunderheads. We need to change the system so that the dunderheads will find it very difficult to survive. That is what we should be doing. Food for thought. Good night.